Winter 1945 descended on Badenfeld like a burial shroud. The small village in western Germany lay skeletal beneath layers of frost, its brick facades pockmarked by artillery fire. Its cobblestone streets cracked and empty. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys because there was nothing left to burn. The war had consumed everything first, the men, then the livestock, then the stored grain, and finally the hope. In the cellar of a half-collapsed bakery, Helga Schneider pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her two children. Liesel, 9 years old, pressed against her mother's side, her cheekbones sharp as knife edges beneath translucent skin. 6-year-old Thomas lay curled in his sister's lap, too weak to shiver anymore. His breathing came shallow and rapid like a bird with a broken wing. "Mama Liesel," whispered her voice barely audible above the wind, howling through broken windows. "Is Tomas going to die?" Helga's hand trembled as she smoothed her daughter's matted hair. She had no answer. That wasn't a lie. For 3 months, the village had survived on boiled tree bark, frozen potatoes, scavenged from abandoned fields, and the occasional rat. Yesterday, Thomas had fainted while trying to carry a bucket of snow to melt for water. Today, he hadn't opened his eyes. Around them, in the darkness, other families huddled in similar configurations of despair. Old Herr Bachmann coughed wetly in the corner, each hack sounding like his last. The widow Zimmermann rocked back and forth, clutching a bundle of rags that had once been her infant grandson. 14 people remained in this cellar. Last week, there had been 19. "They're coming," someone hissed from the cellar entrance. "The Americans are coming." Fear rippled through the darkness, sharper than the cold. For months, the village had been fed a steady diet of propaganda alongside their starvation rations. The Americans were monsters, they'd been told. Savages who would burn what remained of Germany to the ground. Who would execute the men, violate the women, and leave the children to freeze. Helga pulled Liesel and Thomas closer. In her coat pocket, she clutched the last thing of value she owned, a small leather pouch containing 3 pieces of stale bread, saved for a moment of absolute desperation. That moment had arrived days ago, but she'd been too terrified to let it go, as if these crumbs represented the final barrier between her family and oblivion. "What will they do to us?" a young mother named Anna sobbed, clutching her daughter. No one answered. They already knew, or thought they knew. The radio broadcasts had been explicit. The newspaper articles had been vivid. The Americans were coming for revenge, and after what Germany had done, who could blame them? Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the silence was worse. As dawn broke gray and bitter over Badenfeld, the villagers remained underground. They had learned over 4 years of war that daylight brought danger. Planes, artillery, soldiers. Nothing good ever came with the sun. Helga rationed the morning portion, 1 thumbnail-sized piece of bread for each child, softened in melted snow. Thomas couldn't chew. She had to mash it between her fingers and place tiny bits on his tongue, waiting for him to swallow. Each swallow took an eternity. After the 5th attempt, he stopped trying. "Mama, let me go outside," Liesel begged. "Maybe I can find something." "Anything." "No." Helga's voice cracked. "You stay here. You stay where I can see you. But Thomas needs—" I said no. The sharpness of her own voice startled Helga. She was yelling at her daughter for wanting to help her dying brother. What kind of mother had she become? What kind of world had made her this way? Herr Bachmann spoke from his corner, his voice like gravel. "In the Great War, I saw American soldiers. They were not monsters then." "That was different," the widow Zimmermann snapped. "That was before. Before everything. Before." The word hung in the air, heavy with implications, none of them wanted to examine. Before the camps, before the extermination orders, before Germany had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, if the Americans were coming for vengeance, they had earned the right. Throughout the morning, villagers took turns climbing to the cellar entrance, peering through cracks in the boards, reporting what they saw. Nothing yet. Empty streets. Abandoned vehicles. A stray dog pawing at something in the snow, no one wanted to know what. Then just after noon, they heard engines. Multiple engines, low and rumbling, approaching from the west. "They're here," Herr Bachmann whispered. "God help us all." The children began to cry. The adults tried to shush them, terrified that noise would draw attention. Helga wrapped her arms around Liesel and Thomas as if her body could shield them from what was coming. She thought about running, but to where the village was surrounded by open farmland. They'd be spotted and shot within minutes. So they waited, pressed together in the darkness, listening to the engines grow louder, closer, until finally, with a grinding of gears and a hiss of brakes, the vehicle stopped. Right above them. Sergeant William Carter had seen too much death for a man of 26. He'd waded through it in Normandy, swum through it in the Ardennes, and now stood knee-deep in it on the outskirts of Badenfeld. The village looked like something from a nightmare, all broken walls and frozen mud and an awful hanging silence that suggested violence recently concluded. "Spread out," he ordered his squad. "Check for holdouts. And watch for booby traps." His men moved with the weary efficiency of soldiers who'd survived this long by trusting nothing. Private Thomas Reed, a gangly kid from Iowa, kicked open the door of a gutted house. Corporal Danny Mitchell, built like a boxer and twice as mean, swept his rifle across empty windows. They'd liberated 3 towns in the past week, and each one had been the same: abandoned, destroyed, haunted by absence. But something about Badenfeld felt different. Carter couldn't put his finger on it. The damage was extensive but not recent. No bodies in the streets, which was unusual. And he paused. Tilting his head was that smoke, just a thin wisp, barely visible against the gray sky, rising from a collapsed building that had once been a bakery. Reed. Mitchell. On me. They approached cautiously, weapons ready. The smoke was coming from a cellar entrance hidden beneath rubble. Someone had tried to disguise it, but they'd done a poor job. Desperation made people sloppy. Carter signaled for his men to take positions on either side, then called down in German one of the few phrases he'd memorized: Reos kommen, HND Hoch, come out, hands up. Silence. He tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Reed looked at him questioningly. Carter nodded. The private pulled the pin on a smoke grenade, just smoke, nothing lethal, and tossed it into the cellar entrance. Within seconds, coughing erupted from below. Not the deep coughs of soldiers, but higher pitched. Weaker. Children. "Hold fire," Carter barked. Though none of his men had raised their weapons, they'd learned to distinguish between threats and victims, and whatever was in that cellar wasn't threatening anyone. People began to emerge, women first, hands raised, eyes wide with terror. Then the elderly, moving slowly, helping each other up the broken stairs. And finally, the children. So many children, all of them skeletal, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags that might have once been winter coats. Carter had prepared himself for many things, but not for this. Not for the way his stomach twisted at the sight of a girl, no older than his niece, Sarah, so thin he could count her ribs through her dress. Not for the boy who couldn't have been more than 7, carried by his mother, because he lacked the strength to walk. "Jesus Christ," Reed breathed beside him. One of the women, blonde hair streaked with gray face lined with exhaustion, stepped forward. She said something in rapid German that Carter couldn't understand, but he recognized the tone: pleading. Bargaining. The universal language of parents trying to protect their children. Carter lowered his rifle slowly, deliberately, and held up both hands to show he was unarmed. "It's okay," he said, knowing she probably couldn't understand him, but hoping his tone would convey what words couldn't. "We're not going to hurt you." Helga had expected many things when the Americans came. Violence. Theft. Execution. What she hadn't expected was the look on the young sergeant's face when he saw Thomas. Her son had remained unconscious as she carried him from the cellar. His head lolled against her shoulder, his lips tinged with blue, his breathing so shallow she had to press her ear to his chest to confirm he was still alive. When she emerged into the daylight, squinting against the brightness, she found herself face to face with 3 American soldiers whose expressions shifted from wariness to shock to something that looked almost like pain. The sergeant said something to his men in order by the tone of it, and one of them, the younger one with freckles across his nose, immediately slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped forward with his hands out. "May I?" he asked in English, gesturing to Thomas. Helga didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse to clutch her son closer, to not trust the enemy with the most precious thing she had left. But Tomas was dying. If she did nothing, he would be dead by nightfall. She nodded. The soldier, she would later learn his name was Thomas Reed, and the bitter irony of sharing a name with her son would make her laugh and cry simultaneously, took Thomas with a gentleness that shocked her. He cradled the boy against his chest, supporting his head, and called over his shoulder, "Medic. We need a medic now." Another soldier came running, this one with a red cross on his helmet. He knelt beside Reed, opened a medical kit, and began examining Thomas with quick professional movements. He checked the boy's pulse, lifted his eyelids, pressed his stethoscope against the thin chest. Then he looked up at the sergeant and said something that made all 3 soldiers' faces darken. "Starvation," the medic said in German-accented English that Helga could just barely parse. "Severe. Days, maybe hours left." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known, of course. But knowing and hearing it confirmed by a medical professional were different things. Her knees buckled. The sergeant caught her before she fell. "We need to get food into him," the medic continued, but carefully. "His system is too weak for solids. Broth, if we have it. Water with sugar. Small amounts every hour." The Sergeant Carter, she would learn, looked around at the other villagers. At Liesel, swaying on her feet. At the other children, all of them bearing the same telltale signs: distended bellies, stick-thin limbs, eyes too large for their faces. At the adults, not much better off. "How many?" he asked the medic. "All of them. Every single one." Carter closed his eyes for a moment, and Helga saw something cross his face that looked like fury but not directed at them. He pulled a radio from his belt, pressed a button, and spoke rapidly into it. She caught a few words: civilians, critical condition, immediate assistance. Then he turned to his men and said something that changed everything. "Get the rations. All of them. Everything we've got." Private Reed returned 5 minutes later with his arms full. Tin cans, boxes wrapped in waxed paper, canteens of water. He dumped them at Carter's feet and said, "Sir, that's everything from my pack. Mitchell and the others are bringing theirs." The sergeant nodded, then knelt in the snow and began opening cans. The sound of the can opener, that simple mechanical click, 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 made every person in the village freeze. They knew that sound. It meant food. Real food. Not bark or roots or desperation, but actual sustenance. Carter opened the first can and a smell wafted up that made Helga dizzy: beef soup. Rich, thick with chunks of actual meat floating in dark brown broth. He poured some into a metal cup, added water to thin it, and offered it to the medic who was still holding Thomas. Small sips, the medic instructed, lifting the cup to the boy's lips. Just a little at a time. Thomas's eyes fluttered open. For the first time in days, there was something like awareness in them. His cracked lips parted. The medic tipped the cup and a few drops of broth touched his tongue. The boy swallowed. Helga watched her son swallow warm soup, and the tears came so suddenly she couldn't stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sobs, but they came anyway, great heaving gasps that shook her whole body. The sergeant didn't try to stop her. He just kept opening cans. More soldiers arrived, each carrying their own field rations. They set up a makeshift distribution point right there in the street, using crates as tables. Carter organized it with military efficiency, the sickest children first, then the other children, then the adults. Small portions, given slowly with water on the side. Liesel approached hesitantly, her eyes locked on a can of peaches, bright yellow fruit, suspended in clear syrup. One of the soldiers, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, opened the can and offered it to her. She looked at her mother for permission. Helga nodded, still crying. Liesel took the can with shaking hands, lifted it to her lips and drank. Not the fruit, she was too overwhelmed for that, but the syrup, sweet and thick and unlike anything she'd tasted in months. "Mama," she whispered, "it's warm." And it was. Despite the freezing air, despite the snow on the ground, the food was warm. The Americans had heated it somehow? Or their body heat had kept it from freezing, or perhaps it was simply that anything above freezing felt tropical to bodies that had known nothing but cold for so long. Around the makeshift distribution point, similar scenes played out. A grandmother wept as she fed her grandchildren crackers spread with peanut butter. A young mother nursed chocolate powder mixed with water, her baby finally latching on properly for the first time in weeks. Old Herr Bachmann ate a piece of hardtack with the reverence most people reserved for communion wafers. And the Americans watched, saying little, their expressions unreadable. As the initial desperation faded and the edge came off everyone's hunger, the villagers began to process what was happening. The enemy, the monsters they'd been taught to fear, were feeding their children. Not with scraps or leftovers, but with their own rations. Food that should have sustained them through combat operations, through days of marching and fighting, handed over without hesitation to the very people they'd been bombing just weeks ago. The widow Zimmerman approached Carter with halting steps, as if approaching a wild animal she wasn't sure wouldn't bite. She spoke in broken English learned decades ago and barely remembered why you do this. Carter looked at her for a long moment. "What do you mean, why?" "We are." She struggled for the word. "Enemy. Germany. We are enemy." The sergeant's jaw tightened. "You're not soldiers. You're not the people who started this war. You're just people trying to survive." But Zimmerman's voice broke. "Germany, we did. I know what Germany did." Carter's voice was harder now. "I know what I saw at the camps we liberated. I know what happened. But these kids..." He gestured to Liesel, to Thomas, to all the children, eating with desperate focus. "They didn't do that. They're just kids." Helga, who had been listening while feeding Thomas tiny spoonfuls of broth, spoke up in German. Herr Bachmann, who knew some English, translated, she says, "We thought you would kill us. For revenge. For what was done." Carter's expression didn't change. "You probably thought right. There are plenty of guys in this army who want exactly that. Who've seen enough death that they wouldn't hesitate." He paused. "But I'm not those guys. and anyone under my command who can look at a starving kid and think enemy instead of child can turn in their rifle and go home because they're no soldier of mine." The words were translated, passed from person to person. Helga saw the impact ripple through the crowd: confusion, relief, shame, and something else. Something that might have been hope, though none of them quite dared to believe it yet. One of the other soldiers, Mitchell, spoke up in heavily accented German. "I have daughter, 7 years old, in Chicago. If I saw her like this, starving, and someone gave her food, I would pray for them every day for rest of my life. I don't care who they are. Army, enemy, devil himself. You feed a starving child, you're doing God's work." Anna, the young mother, translated this for those who hadn't understood. When she finished, several women were crying again. Reed added in English, "My mom used to say, there's no such thing as an enemy child. Just children in a bad situation." I didn't really get it until now. The medic finished examining Tomas and gave Helga a cautiously optimistic report. "He's responding. His pulse is stronger. If we can keep food in him for the next 48 hours, carefully in small amounts, he'll survive." Survive. The word seemed impossible. Yesterday, Helga had been planning her son's funeral in her head, trying to figure out how to dig a grave in frozen ground. Today, an American medic was telling her he might survive. Why, she asked the same question Zimmerman had posed. "Warm." The medic understood. "Because I'm a doctor before I'm a soldier. And a human before I'm either of those things." As the afternoon wore on and more of Carter's unit arrived, the true scale of what the Americans were doing became apparent. They weren't just sharing some of their rations. They were giving away all of them. Sir. One of the privates said quietly, "Supply trucks won't reach us until Friday at the earliest." "I know." "I know that too, Private. But look at them." Carter nodded toward Tomas, who was sleeping now, the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. "We can handle 3 days of being uncomfortable." "They can't handle another 3 hours." The private nodded and went back to distributing rations. Reed sat down in the snow next to Liesel, who was making her way through a can of beans with single-minded focus. He pulled out a photograph from his pocket and showed it to her, a little girl with pigtails grinning toothlessly at the camera. "My sister," he said in English. "Sarah. She's 8. Liesel studied the photograph with great seriousness, then looked at Reed. "Pretty," she said, one of the few English words she knew. Reed smiled. Yeah, she is." He paused, then added, "I'm going to write to her tonight. Tell her about you. Tell her how brave you are." Liesel didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She reached out and touched the photograph gently, reverently, as if it were made of glass. Around them, similar moments of connection were happening. Mitchell was teaching a group of children a hand-clapping game, one that transcended language barriers. Another soldier was showing Herr Bachmann how to use a modern can opener, the old man's arthritic hands struggling with the mechanism until the soldier simply opened the can for him and handed it over with a small bow of respect. The medic was moving from person to person, conducting basic health checks and dispensing medical supplies from his kit. Bandages for cuts, ointment for frostbite, aspirin for the fevers that several of the children were running. "When these supplies run out, we'll be in the same boat as you. But at least we'll all be in it together." Helga looked at this young American man. He couldn't have been more than 22, and saw in his face an exhaustion that matched her own. He'd seen things, she realized. Terrible things. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare she recognized from her late husband, who'd fought in the Great War and never quite came home from it, even when his body did. "Thank you," she said in German. "Danke." The medic smiled tiredly. "Bitte," he replied. "You're welcome." As the winter sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across the ruins of Badenfeld, the village had transformed. Not physically. The buildings were still destroyed, the streets still empty, but in spirit. Where there had been despair, there was now something tentative and fragile that might have been hope. The soldiers built fires using wood scavenged from collapsed buildings. They arranged the villagers in a circle around the flames, children closest to the heat, adults forming a protective outer ring. Someone produced a harmonica and began playing a folk tune, German, surprisingly not American. One of the soldiers knew it, though he didn't volunteer how. Thomas was awake now, held in his mother's arms, watching the flames with wonder. His color had improved slightly, the blue tinge fading from his lips. He was still desperately ill, still fragile, but he was alive and his eyes were clear. "Mama," he whispered. "Are they angels?" Helga didn't know how to answer. Angels didn't wear military uniforms or carry rifles. Angels didn't have blood on their boots or exhaustion carved into every line of their faces. But angels fed the hungry and healed the sick and showed mercy when vengeance would have been easier. "I think," she said slowly, "they might be." Liesel, sitting beside them, spoke up. "Engel." She said the German word for angels. She pointed at Reed, at Carter, at all the soldiers. "Engel." The word spread through the group. The German villagers began using it hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction. "Engel." When Bachmann translated it for the Americans, several of them looked uncomfortable. "We're not angels," Carter said firmly. "We're just doing what's right." "Sometimes," Bachmann replied in careful English, "that is exactly what angels do." As full dark fell, the Americans organized sleeping arrangements. They had a few tents which they gave to the families with the smallest children. They had blankets, thick military-issue wool, which they distributed without keeping any for themselves. When Anna protested that the soldiers would freeze, Mitchell shrugged. "We've slept in worse. We'll manage." But they didn't have to manage alone. The villagers, with a kind of stubborn practicality that comes from surviving impossible circumstances, refused to let the Americans go without. They shared their space in the cellar, cramped though it was. They pooled their few remaining blankets with the American ones, creating a communal warmth that would see them all through the night. And so they slept, former enemies, huddled together against the cold, with the children nestled in the warmest spots and the soldiers keeping watch in shifts, as much to protect the villagers as to guard against external threats. Word of what happened in Badenfeld spread with the speed that only truly remarkable stories achieve. Within days, soldiers throughout the Western Front were hearing about Sergeant Carter's unit and the starving village they'd saved. The story grew in the telling, acquiring the mythic quality that wartime tales often do, but the core remained true. American soldiers had given their own food to German civilians, including children of the enemy they'd been fighting for years. The reaction among the troops was mixed. Some scoffed, calling it soft-headed stupidity. Others felt a grudging respect. And some, more than anyone expected, began doing the same thing. In the village of Kronberg, a company of American engineers, building a temporary bridge, found a family of 6 living in a bombed-out church. They shared their rations without being asked. In Mannheim, a medical unit treating wounded soldiers extended their care to injured German civilians, going so far as to give them precious plasma and antibiotics. In Heidelberg, an entire platoon voted to reduce their own food allotments by half and distribute the difference to an orphanage housing 43 children whose parents had been killed in the bombing campaigns. The officers struggled with how to respond. Officially, these actions violated supply protocols. Practically, they were winning hearts and minds more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have. Morally. Well, morally, it was hard to condemn soldiers for feeding starving children. Captain James Morrison Carter's commanding officer visited Badenfeld 3 days after the initial incident. He found a village that, while still devastated, was no longer dying. Children had color in their cheeks. The adults were beginning to organize basic repair work on the most salvageable buildings. And everywhere he looked, he saw American soldiers working alongside German civilians, sharing labor and limited resources with an easy camaraderie that would have been unthinkable just days before. Sergeant Carter Morrison said, pulling the young man aside, "I should probably write you up for unauthorized distribution of military supplies." Carter stiffened. "Yes, sir. But I'm not going to." "You know why?" "No, sir." Morrison gestured to the village. "Because this is what winning looks like. Not tanks rolling through a conquered city, not enemy soldiers surrendering. This. People who thought we were monsters learning that we're human. Children who'll grow up remembering that an American soldier saved their life." He paused. "The war's going to end, Carter. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next month, but it's ending. And when it does, we're going to have to live in the same world as these people. Better they remember us for feeding them than for destroying them." Carter nodded slowly. "Does that mean?" "It means keep doing what you're doing. And if anyone higher up the chain gives you grief about it, you send them to me." 2 weeks after the liberation of Badenfeld, Private Thomas Reed sat in his tent and wrote a letter to his sister, Sarah. It was late past midnight, but he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thomas, the little German boy who'd almost died, who now ran around the village playing with other children like starvation had been a bad dream. "Dear Sarah," he wrote, "I met a boy today who reminded me of you." He told her about Badenfeld, about the cellar, and the starving children and the soup that had saved lives. He told her about Liesel, who'd learned to say thank you in English and said it approximately 500 times a day. He told her about Helga, who hugged him every morning with tears in her eyes, and about old Herr Bachmann, who'd started teaching the American soldiers German while they taught him American card games. "The thing is," Reed continued, "these people are just like us. They want their kids to be safe and fed and happy. They want the war to end. They didn't want any of this." He paused, pen hovering over paper. "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that the Germans did terrible things, and you're right. They did. I've seen some of the camps, Sarah. I've seen things I'll never be able to unsee. But the people in Badenfeld didn't do that. Most of them didn't even know it was happening. And the kids definitely didn't. So when people ask me after the war what I did, I'm not going to tell them about the battles I fought or the missions I completed. I'm going to tell them about the day we fed a village of starving children. Because that's the day I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were doing something right in the middle of all this wrong." He signed the letter, sealed it, and added it to the outgoing mailbag. Then he went to sleep and for the first time in months had no nightmares. Spring came to Badenfeld, slowly pushing back the bitter cold one, grudging degree at a time. The villagers strengthened by regular food supplies. The American military now provided began the monumental work of rebuilding, not just structures but lives. Helga found work at the American field headquarters cooking for the soldiers. It was strange, she reflected, spending her days preparing meals for the same army that had bombed her city, but the cognitive dissonance faded when she saw their faces. They were so young, most of them. Boys pretending to be men carrying the weight of a war they hadn't started. Sergeant Carter had been transferred to another unit, much to the village's dismay, but he'd left behind men who'd learned his philosophy: see the people, not the enemy. Private Reed remained assigned to reconstruction efforts. He'd taken to spending his off-duty hours teaching English to the village children using picture books his mother sent from Iowa. Thomas had recovered fully, though the medic warned he might have health complications later in life from the severe malnutrition. For now, though, he was a 6-year-old boy, again running and playing and eating with the voracious appetite of childhood. He followed Reed everywhere, calling him me and Engel my angel, until Reed taught him to say my friend instead. "I'm not an angel, buddy," Reed said in his improving German. "I'm just a guy who had some soup when you needed it." But Thomas shook his head stubbornly. "Engel," he insisted. Liesel, always more pragmatic than her brother, had a different take on it. She told her mother one evening as they prepared dinner in their partially repaired home, "Angels don't wear boots. Angels don't get tired." But Thomas and Sergeant Carter and all of them, they were tired. They were hungry. They gave us their food even though they needed it. That's better than angels. That's people being good when they don't have to be. Helga looked at her 9-year-old daughter and marveled at the wisdom war had forced upon her. "You're right," she said softly. "That is better." In June of 1945, as Germany surrendered and the war in Europe officially ended, Helga sat down to write a letter. She'd been composing it in her head for months, but actually putting pen to paper felt momentous, like testimony that needed to be preserved. She addressed it to Sergeant William Carter, care of the U. Army headquarters, though she had no idea if it would reach him. Then she began to write. "Dear Sergeant Carter, I do not know if you will receive this letter, or if you will remember me and my family from the small village of Badenfeld. But I must write it anyway because some things must be said even if no one hears them. You saved my son's life. That is a simple fact, like saying the sun rises or water flows downward. He was dying and you gave him food and now he is alive. But you did something more than that. You showed us that humans can choose to be human even in war. For years, we were told that Americans were monsters, that you hated us, wanted to destroy us, would show no mercy. And why shouldn't you? After what Germany did to the world, after the camps and the killing and the horror, we deserved your hatred. We expected it. We feared it. But you didn't hate us. You saw hungry children and you fed them. You saw sick people and you healed them. You gave away your own food, knowing you would go hungry. You showed mercy when you had every right to show vengeance. My children call you angels. I know you told them you are not, but they insist. Perhaps they are right in a way you do not understand. Angels are not perfect beings without flaws. Angels are messengers who show us what we can be if we choose goodness over hatred, compassion over cruelty. You were our angels, Sergeant Carter. You and your men. You came to us in our darkest hour and reminded us that humanity was not lost, that kindness had not died in the ashes of war. My son is alive. My daughter is healthy. We are rebuilding. And every day when I watch them play in the sunshine, I pray for you and your men. I pray you all make it home safely. I pray you find peace after what you have seen and done. And I pray that someday when you are old and gray and your grandchildren ask you what you did in the war, you tell them about the day you fed a village of starving children, because that is the day you won the war. Not the battles. Not the victories. That day when you chose mercy. With eternal gratitude, Helga Schneider. She mailed the letter, having no idea if it would arrive. But 6 weeks later, she received a reply. Carter had gotten it. He'd shared it with his entire unit, and he'd written back thanking her for the reminder that they'd done something good in the middle of so much bad. They exchanged Christmas cards, photos of growing families, news of rebuilding lives. Helga's letters taught them about post-war Germany. Their letters taught her about America. And always in every exchange, there was that underlying current of gratitude and wonder that enemies had become friends, that hatred had transformed into understanding, that in the worst of times, humanity had prevailed. 40 years later, in 1985, Liesl Schneider, now Liesl Hartmann, married with 3 children of her own, stood in her nursing uniform and watched a bus full of refugees arrive from Bosnia. The war in Yugoslavia had created another generation of displaced, hungry, traumatized children, and she'd volunteered to help with the medical screening. A colleague asked her why she devoted so much time to refugee work when her own practice was busy enough without it. Liesl thought about a winter day when she was 9 years old, when she'd been so hungry she couldn't remember what full felt like, when an American soldier with freckles had given her a can of peaches and called her brave. She thought about her brother who'd grown up to become a doctor, inspired by the medic who'd saved his life. She thought about her mother who, until her dying day, had kept a photograph of Sergeant Carter on her mantle. "I'm alive because someone showed me mercy when they didn't have to," she said simply. "I'm alive because a soldier on the other side of the world gave me his food and called me child instead of enemy. The least I can do is pass that forward." The colleague nodded, not fully understanding, but respecting the conviction in her voice. As Liesl walked toward the refugees, children with hollow eyes and gaunt faces, mothers who looked like they'd forgotten how to hope, she thought about angels. Real angels, not the winged creatures from storybooks, but human beings who chose compassion when hatred would have been easier. She thought about how one act of kindness multiplied across thousands of small moments and individual choices could change the trajectory of history, not through grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but through soup given to a hungry child, through blankets shared on a cold night, through the simple revolutionary act of seeing another person's humanity and choosing to honor it. War had taught them to fear each other. A bowl of warm soup had taught them to trust again. And in the end, Liesl reflected as she knelt beside a little girl who looked exactly like she'd looked 40 years ago, trust was always stronger than fear. Kindness was always more powerful than cruelty. Love in all its forms would always outlast hate. The angels of Badenfeld had taught her that. And now she would teach it to the next generation. Because some lessons are too important to ever forget.